complex kinetic modeling, catalysis, novel biochemical pathways, and polymerization, depolymerization kinetics. She is internationally recognized for her contribution in complex kinetics modeling of a diverse range of chemistries. Her group has developed the capability to build the most detailed model you would see for depolymerization and has depolymerization creating the first mechanistic model for biomass decomposition, which was translated to industrial practice. That is a feat in itself. And she is also interested in detailed modeling of polymer recycling. She is an early leader in advancing applications of stochastic simulations, developing a novel acceleration method that allows simulation of copolymerization to be sped up for the process development by industrial collaborators. For her contributions, she was elected to the National Academy of Engineering in 2019, and in 2021, she was elected to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. Now, as her website states, that she's working on big ideas, but at very small scales. So today, let's welcome her as she talks about one of those big ideas about developing strategies for polymer redesign and recycling using reaction pathway analysis. Please welcome her for the keynote talk.
So this is on. Great. So thank you very much for the kind introduction. Hopefully, I'll live up to that introduction in what we're going to go through today. And so we are going to talk about polymer redesign and recycling using reaction pathway analysis. So many of you in this room, and as we just heard, some nice talks related to thinking about how can we recover value from today's polymers. So these are polymers that we all use, love, and can we figure out ways to recover value from them? And there are a variety of different technologies that you can think about. And our group is indeed thinking about some feedstock recycling methods, in particular pyrolysis, and thinking about both catalytic pyrolysis and in the absence of catalysts. But we're also thinking about polymers that we can actually depolymerize back to monomer or monomer-like polymers. So those are typically your step growth polymers that are, it's more easy to take those back to monomer. And so we'll talk a little bit about a system here. But really, I think what a lot of us are thinking about is how can we redesign polymers for tomorrow? So how can we think about upfront polymers that we then have the functionality that we need, but also can be depolymerized or brought back to monomer. And so these are some vignettes that I'm going to cover today, but really just focusing on these two because they have a little more of a catalytic connection. If you want to talk about pyrolysis, I'm happy to do that, but I won't give any specific results today. However, you saw in the title that the idea was reaction pathway analysis. So what does that mean in our hands of how we're thinking about how to understand these systems? And so we'll just talk a little bit about some terminology so that you know where we sit when we're attacking problems in this space. And so when I say I'm doing reaction pathway analysis, you can think about that in a number of different ways. The TGA that was mentioned earlier today typically is analyzed what's called using a lumped model, and so that is where you have some polymer and you get some product, and you simply ascribe a rate coefficient to it, the species, the rate coefficients are lumped. If you want to get more granularity, so you say, well, I want to know about getting monomer back from my polymer, then you might formulate what's called a pathways level model, where now the species are molecules, and you can see I've written some molecules here. But the problem is that the rate coefficients are still lumped quantities. So you might be able to use this for process design, but it still obviates maybe some of the details that are going on and might not be able to be extrapolated well. The one where we typically sit is mechanistic models. And so we saw some nice examples today of starting to understand mechanisms and how that impacted the polymer degradation. And so in this case, you have, say, radicals in the case of pyrolysis, and then the molecules that you're tracking our monomer or our molecules. But the key here is that the rate coefficients are individual elementary steps. And so that really gives us the opportunity to leverage theory to bring theory to bear in order to understand these reactions. How do you put it all together? So we've heard this morning about there are lots of long chains, there are lots of events that are happening. The formulation that we use is really one of two flavors. One is what's referred to as continuous distribution kinetics. And so you're putting together moment-based models where you're tracking tracking not only the chain length distribution, what's happening to all the chains, so you can watch averages as a function of the reaction conditions, but you also can track small molecules. So we'd be able to watch what's happening to the molecular weight that might be measured by size exclusion chromatography, but then we'd also be able to look at small molecules coming out, methane, maybe as an example. But we also use a different formulation. So that's more the continuum formulation. We also use a stochastic formulation. So that's what's referred to as kinetic Monte Carlo. The value of that is that you're watching individual chains rather than fields of chains, rather than concentrations. And so that might be advantageous to you if you're thinking about, say, sequence of a polymer matters. There's a trigger in the middle of the chain, and what it's next to really matters. And so you can very much track that detail of the chains and implement that in the kinetics. And so that's another possibility. So we have done this extensively for a number of different systems. The beauty is that many of the reactions that we talk about in these polymer degradation spaces are what are called families. That is, the pyrolysis chemistry is complicated just because there are lots of chain lengths, lots of radical positions, lots of different options. But it's very simple in terms of what can happen. So bond fission, chain transfer, etc. So we've done that for a variety of polyolefins. And then we've used a hierarchical approach to get at the rate coefficients. And so in general, if somebody has an experimental value, we'll use it. But otherwise, we're using theory and estimation methods, leveraging the idea of structure reactivity relationships in order to get at individual elementary steps. So in case you haven't gotten our tendencies yet, let me just summarize clearly here. You can think of that there are different levels of chemistry that you incorporate, with the most detailed being mechanistic. But you also have different solution methods that you could use in order to be even more detailed. And our group tends to sit up here. We like mechanistic models and we like tracking lots of detail. And so that's where we think we can offer the most value and insight. Okay, so why is this harder maybe for macromolecular materials? The biomass community knows this well, the polymer community also. There are lots of things that impact the reactivity and that we might need to take into account. And so polymers have structure, including tacticity. So atactic polypropylene doesn't react with the same kinetics as syndiotactic polypropylene. There might be effects from crystallinities. Many of the polymers we deal with are semi-crystalline amorphous polymers. The molecular weight, mentioned earlier that the chain length matters. This community very much is engaged in the idea of polymers interacting with catalysts. So what does that really mean? How accessible is a heterogeneous porous catalyst to the polymer or vice versa? Conformation matters. And then I said we could leverage quantum chemical calculations, but that comes with its complications. These are high molecular weight materials. So do you make mimics, small molecule mimics in order to get at the kinetics you're interested in? I will talk a little bit about a system where conformation has been a real issue. And then a lot of these reactions are happening in different environments. And so how do you, in a quantum chemical context, make sure that you're mimicking that environment? So those are just some general challenges that you can think about as we're going through here. But let me tell you two stories. These are actually current work that's going on. So happy to get some input here to help us shape this work. We're involved in polyethylene terephthalate solvolysis. So this is a good system in the sense that we're going to get back to depolymerize back to monomer. So this is a process that we're involved in with some collaborators at in the Bottle Consortium centered at NREL. And this is what's called the VOLCAT process. So that is named for volatile catalyst. So it's just an amine-based catalyst where it carries out glycolysis. If you carry out glycolysis, you can get back to very high yields of what would be a monomer-like species. So we got involved in this because we wanted to, essentially, we could build a model that could be used in techno-economic analysis, life cycle analysis. And so we got involved in this. And it became very interesting in the sense that it was also a good test case for our kinetic Monte Carlo framework. So we're going to use kinetic Monte Carlo here. We're going to simulate all the chains explicitly. The first thing you need to do if you're going to depolymerize chains, you have to initialize the computer with the distribution of chains you're going to react. So we know from experiments, the initial weight average and number average molecular weight. It's a step growth polymer, so we're going to enforce a most probable distribution. We need to truncate that distributions, with a reasonable, capturing a reasonable number of the chains. This is a semi-crystalline polymer, and as measured, it was 40% crystalline. We are going to bucket those then into two distinct chains, buckets of chains, crystalline and amorphous chains that are going to have different rate coefficients. If you know anything about polymers, don't get worried yet. We're gonna correct this because they're not two separate buckets of chains. But this was our first generation model. And then we are going to have events that will allow us to track what bonds are breaking. So in general, most of the bonds are going to be mid-chain bonds. These are long polymers. They have lots of mid-chain bonds. But we want to know if the bonds near the ends are breaking as separate events so that we can track small molecules that are coming off. Then we need the reaction pathways. You'll see this is not mechanistic. So we do have work going on for mechanistic interaction of a catalyst with the bonds, the active site, depolymerization. This is at the pathways level where we have different possibilities and keep track of all the different events that can happen. There are rate coefficients. There's actually a baseline. If you just react polyethylene terephthalate in glycol at these temperatures that I'm going to show you, you will get reaction to happen, but the catalyst speeds that up. But we're going to include both uncatalyzed and catalyzed cases. So here's what the data looks like. And so I think this is similar to the kinds of experiments that were talked about earlier today, where we have it's in a reactor as a function of time. The molecular weight is decaying. This is the number average, the weight average molecular weight, and the points then are the experimental measures, and the lines are experiments. And so we're able to capture that temperature dependence quite well. We also capture the evolution of the one of the main small molecules, but others as well. This is the dominant one, where it's a mole percent as a function of time, increasing temperature, and you can see that we do a reasonable job of capturing this with this relatively simple first generation model. What you're seeing here, though, you already knew from the experiments, right? You already knew how the molecular weight and the BHAT evolution behaved as a function of time and temperature. And so what can we really get from the model that's a little harder to glean? And so if you blow up this region, you clearly see this sort of S-shaped behavior that might not have been as apparent in the data, but is clear in the model in order to capture the experimental data. And basically what is happening, a lot of the people in the polymer degradation community like to say, oh, is it end-chain scission or is it mid-chain scission? This is showing you it's clearly both, meaning there are lots of bonds that are breaking in the middle early. Then you start making a lot more ends. Once those ends start getting made, there's a kind of autocatalytic behavior where you can peel off the small molecule that is indeed coming from that end chain event. So that the model is able to clearly show that. And if you really wanted to get at more information, you could get at even all of the different events that are taking place. So you can, in any snapshot in time, say how many events of different types have taken place, and you can watch this as a function of conditions and how that evolves. Excuse me, as the reaction changes. So this kinetic Monte Carlo really allows you to get at very detailed information. But I said that we needed to think about what's really going on with this polymer, and that gets you in the realm of the polymer physics, as in this idea of putting the chains into two distinct categories, amorphous and crystalline, clearly is a simplification. And so the question is, what can you do better? And if you think about polyethylene terephthalate, so it's a semi-crystalline polymer with a spherolytic morphology. And so we are really thinking about collaborating with, we are collaborating with members at SLAC, where they're able to see a lot of information about the actual morphology of the polymer. And if you think about these chains, they're really these chains that have these crystalline domains, so they're stacked on top of each other with some fixed length. But then there are ties that are connecting distinct crystalline regions. There are loops that might be more strained. So those are connecting adjacent crystalline regions and so on. And so we are developing what we call Model 2.0, where we're implementing explicitly those distributions of loops, tails, ties. Then there will be these crystalline domains. These can each have different rate coefficients, and we can really put in information about the structure of the polymer and simulate using kinetic Monte Carlo. So that's kind of where we are with that. But let's move to the last vignette, which is thinking about, well, what if we thought about designing monomers and polymers from the beginning such that they could be degraded easily? And so this is really work that is a collaboration with Eugene Chen's group at Colorado State, part of the Bottle Consortium, as well as interacting with Tobin Marks at Northwestern and Yuri Rahman at MIT, where we're thinking about this more holistic loop structure, circular economy of polymer and monomer redesign. Our contribution here is bringing our pathway design tools. And in particular, we are using this in order to discover new monomers. And so the idea is that we are going to use our methods to automatically generate reaction networks where we are going to have some starting molecule. Typically, it's going to be some bio-based compound if we want to think about a circular economy. And then we're going to discover new pathways of how to get from those starting points to some monomer along the way, possibly coming up with new molecules. And this relies on our ability to be a bit agnostic to the catalytic chemistry that we're carrying out, as in we're going to leverage both biology and chemistry. This is really an idea that stemmed out of Brent Shank's ERC, where they were thinking about this concatenation of biology and chemistry working together. So the idea is that we are going to have some target that we're interested in, and we're going to try to come from some pathways starting from a bio-based compound. So this is genome scale model abbreviation, just to be a representation of that. In practice, if you just say, well, I can have biology, I can have chemistry, like how do you actually put them together? In practice, we typically do it. We do some generations of biology and then maybe one functionalization by chemistry. So we can do it versatilely, but this is how it's being carried out here. We have operators that cover all of known biochemistry. So if we want to do the biological part, we automatically map to them from this Metasic database and then check how much they cover of other databases, and they cover 90% of those reactions. So this just says, yes, our set of operators know about all biochemistry. We also have a growing list. This has been a little harder to automate. So it's a growing list of chemocatalytic operators. So these would be certainly names of types of reactions that you recognize. We have an operator for each of them. Our list has about 180 operators. We're working on some nitrogen chemistry and some sulfur chemistry, but in general, imagine we can cover all of known chemocatalysis as well. And if you were interested, you could get the framework for carrying out this reaction network generation. So that's freely available on GitHub. All right, so let's apply this. This was particularly a project where we were looking to replace polyurethanes. Polyurethanes are, I think, the sixth most voluminous polymer. They're really a family of materials, so there's not one polyurethane. It has a variety of structures. But we were working with John Torkelson's group at Northwestern University, where John is designing polyhydroxyurethanes as a variant of polyurethanes. And so they have this hydroxyl group pendant on them. And these are then trying to get properties of polyurethanes. The other benefit is that they are synthesized from amines and cyclic carbonates, and so they get rid of the isocyanate. So that might be another environmental benefit that you could see here. So in our hands, what we're doing is we're looking and saying, let's find possible cyclic carbonates and epoxies. So just concentrating on the oxygen-containing part, not the nitrogen part. We are looking for cyclic carbonates and epoxides, and we're going to see if we can discover any novel molecules that in turn could be incorporated into polyhydroxyurethanes, which in turn could be embedded in a circular recovery schema. So that's the basic idea. So we started with, so we got to initialize our network generation method. We started with a set of molecules that were reported by Mary Biddy and her colleagues at NREL at the time of chemicals that can come from biomass with near or market near-term potential. So we initialize with those. And we just need some kind of helper molecules to do the chemistry as outlined in this set of operators. So this is a relatively limited exploration, has a relatively small set of operators. These were kind of the go-to operators that Jim Domesic and Brent said, you know, really these are the reaction families that we do very well with oxygenated compounds. So let's start with those. You start in the middle with your starting molecule, you go out in a generational mode. So this just gives you a picture of what we're doing. But what we're doing is looking in then this sea of blue dots for molecules that could be cyclic carbonates or epoxides. And so the good news is that we get some. So these I won't keep you on that. So the good news is we get some, so that was the starting molecule, and then there were the molecules that were generated in 2 generations. But after, and in summary, it is 21 molecules out of 20,000 possible molecules that had the functionality that we were looking for. However, polyurethanes are used in network form as well. So they're both linear polyurethanes as well as network polyurethanes. So we need more functional groups so that we can create networks. And so we wanted to look for 3 or more target molecules. And so we need to expand the network. Here, we went ahead and just moved from those 21 candidates and built out. That's more a computational limit than it is a kind of philosophical approach. But so it just says we want to keep the exploration a little bit controlled. But here's how what we get. And let me walk you through this set of graphs a little bit. So on the axis would be how many cyclic carbonate or epoxy moieties they are. If we want a network, we need 3 or more. So we need to be out there. The hashed bars are actually, if you just went to PubChem, because you said, why are you doing all this network generation? Why don't you just go grab all the molecules from a big database like PubChem that has millions of molecules? And so that's actually what is in the hash bars here. Most of those molecules don't have cyclic carbonates or epoxies, but there are some that have 1, 2, or 3, but kind of diminishing returns as you go out. The black bars are our molecules, and you can see that we are generating lots of molecules that have the requisite functionality. So by kind of steering the chemistry, we are getting to molecules that have the functionality we're interested in. And many of them are novel. So you can do the Venn diagram compared to those PubChem molecules with the 1, 2, 3, 4 functionality, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And anything in the gray then would be a molecule that, at least as reported, is not yet known to PubChem. So these would be novel molecules. So these would be candidates now that we could look at and say, are they going to make good polyhydroxyurethanes? Don't know why it struggles with those tables, but John Torkelson's group really didn't want to synthesize any monomers. They said, are there any on your list that are actually commercially available? So not necessarily novel, but still maybe ones we hadn't thought about that come from a bio-based source, because remember, we've traced where it came from, that starting molecule. And so I circle some here. Circle some here just to point out that yes, we can indeed do a query against Zinc database or Sigma to find out if it's commercially available. So that's the basic idea. But now we have to think about these polymers and what properties they have. So at the moment, we just have some potentially good candidates for monomers. And this really gets into what metrics we might like to use for intrinsically circular polymers. This is a slide that's borrowed from Eugene, who talks about this really in terms of both kinetics and thermodynamics. That is, you need to be able to trap the polymer such that it has good properties during its use state, but then you want to be able to trigger it in order to depolymerize using catalysts in order to selectively depolymerize back to monomer. We are going to start not with the kinetics, although we are doing some of that as well with some of the nylon polymers that Tobin Mark's group is we're looking at. But for today, we're just going to look at what we thought was going to be an easier property to estimate, and that is the sealing temperature. So the sealing temperature is a thermodynamic property. It's based on heat of polymerization and the entropy of polymerization. And it's basically the temperature above which you would depolymerize, below which you polymerize. So it is kind of a threshold value that you can think of into categories. So if it's some low sealing temperature, you could maybe call that intrinsically circular. In this range, these would be good candidates for that trigger based on catalysis to get you to get back to monomer. And here, this is the realm of pyrolysis, really. So once you have such a high sealing temperature material, you open up so many other reaction channels that even if it could go back to monomer by one pathway, the other reaction pathways are going to really trouble your selectivity. So we're looking for generally this category of so let's try to do this using density functional theory. We had done this a number of years ago to estimate actually rate constants for polymerization using DFT, and therefore also got the thermodynamics. We thought this would be very straightforward. But when you start diving in, you see that, well, there are lots of things to think about. Like, what mimic are you going to use for your density functional theory? How do you terminate it? Or does that really matter in the polymer? There was to talk about kind of N chain and all that methane. Maybe that was particular because of an N group that was helping to initiate something. The solvent, the phase, lots of conformations. Polymers have lots of options. And then just the typical DFT choice of level of theory. What level are you going to choose for that? So we went ahead and started with just what we thought was a good data set, because the sealing temperature for vanillic polymers is reasonably available. And these are many of them. Many vanillic polymers have been looked at in the gas phase, so then all the effective solvent is not going to be important. So we did it in a test. This is a test method using vanillic polymers, and you can see that the enthalpy polymerization is fairly well correlated. The entropy, not so much. This is kind of going to be the story of the day here. The entropy is very hard to get. But when you take it, because this range is not so big, you take it into the sealing temperature, you get a reasonable correlation. And so the idea here would be, all right, if I can estimate using DFT, delta H and delta S, I can put it in my correlation and get a prediction of its sealing temperature. So that's the way we would use this in practice. But then we started trying to look at some of the lactone-based polymers that Eugene had looked at, and kind of some substituted lactones. And there were very interesting trends of the sealing temperature that was being reported. When you start then digging in, you see that sealing temperature is definitely not one property. There is not a sealing temperature of a polymer, because it depends on, you saw that monomer concentration in the denominator, so it depends on that. That's really that was the standard state entropy. It also, this is a nice contribution in the literature where they looked at this particular monomer and looked at it in two different solvents and as a function of the monomer concentration, so a function of the solvent amount. And so if you translate this into sealing temperature language, you can see that you would have an array of different sealing temperatures that are dependent on both the solvent identity as well as the solvent amount. So this really would be what we would need if we wanted to screen conditions and polymers for recyclability. So we set out to try to come up with a generalized workflow for this. This is a bit of a work in progress, but reasonably well vetted in the sense that we need to look at lots of conformations. So we're doing just some MD in order to do that, and then progressively get using some Boltzmann weighting to pick out conformations. We are getting fewer structures, higher level of theory, till ultimately we would get at that heat of polymerization and to polymerization. So let me show you how this is turning out so far. So this is for this delta Valera lactone. This is now experimental data that I'm highlighting for you first. So this is in toluene in bulk. The first thing you would want to see is that the heat of polymerization is slightly different. The entropy of polymerization is slightly different, and the sealing temperature is different. So this is what we would want to get. So let's look at the toluene side first. So this is looking at a particular level of theory using a particular delta S solvation borrowed from Garza's method in the literature with a particular end capping structure to mimic the end of the polymer chain. And you can see that it's not great. That is, the enthalpy is a bit off, but the entropy is way off. And so this translates into a sealing temperature that is not close. Well, let's see if there's something we can do. We borrowed a method from Rompe's group where they actually were trying to get rid of this end chain effect in polymers by doing loop-like structures, and then you extrapolate to 1/1 infinite length to try extrapolate back to 0 to get infinite length. And so you take away those n groups. We changed the method during the time we were doing this work a little bit, and you can see that it really didn't have that much of an effect. So that loop structure isn't mattering too much compared to using these methyl groups. We also got rid of that delta S solvation correction. That would come important in a moment, and that also didn't matter too much. How did this work? And just let's try the same method. Let's apply it to the bulk conditions where we use a continuum solvent with a monomer-like mimic. And you can see that it's not bad for the enthalpy, but it's terrible for the entropy. And so this continuum solvation model really is not doing a good job getting at that the entropy value. And of course, the entropy's in the denominator, enthalpy's in the numerator, error in either one of those. If you just do standard error propagation, you can have a very large error on the sealing temperature. And so that's really what we're seeing here. So then Sherry decided to go ahead and incorporate an explicit monomer or an explicit solvent. So we start putting explicit molecules in. I think kind of the electrochemistry, electrocatalysis community is ahead of us on this. That's the way to get at solvation effects with water near surfaces. But basically, we're going to put in explicit solvents, and that's really going to take into account then the kind of entropic change of a monomer surrounded by itself, then suddenly incorporated into a polymer. And that works better. So this is looking pretty good in terms of the enthalpy is spot on. The entropy, you'll see that this has finally gotten down to these are low entropy values. So it's finally gotten down to a low entropy value that is a hallmark of these solution-based lactone polymerizations. But here you see the error propagation really showing. So the question is how much to push this approach. We're going to keep at it because we're a little stubborn. We're going to keep going. But you could also imagine you could take a completely different approach. And so we're also exploring that. We're doing some molecular simulations because this is a thermodynamic property. Won't necessarily help us with the kinetics that we were hoping to map as easily, but it will get at TC. And then we're also using machine learning because this machine learning framework is compatible with what our collaborators have been doing for what's called PolyID. So they've developed a machine learning framework to estimate the properties of polymers. They have 8 properties shown here as glass transition temperature and melting temperature. And so you can really imagine embedding this in a cyclical predictive mode. And so just to summarize really the talk in total, it is we started with biological feedstocks. Those are derivatized using network generation to make known and novel monomer candidates. Now you can link this up with this in silico polymer generator, which can be then married with the property prediction from PolyID. We could throw TC in there as our other property. We can do some experimental tests. And then we can go back to the idea of breaking the polymer down to get back to the biological feedstocks. So that's really where we are in this use of reaction pathway analysis for a variety of different applications. And I told you really about 2 of them. I'd like to thank the collaborators, great collaborators who have worked on this, as well as the funding agencies, and happy to take questions if there's time.